Good evening, and welcome to our Waltham Public Library program, Black Veterans with Dr. Chad Williams of Brandeis University. This is part of our series, A Year of Black History. My name is Deborah Hoffman, and I organize programs and events for the library. Thanks for tuning in. Before we start, I want to let you know how the evening will go. Our speaker will do a 25-minute presentation, and then he'll field questions. To ask questions via the chat function, use a Google account to sign into YouTube. Feel free to write your questions at any time, and then I'll read them during the Q&A. Dr. Chad Williams is the Samuel J. and Augusta Spector Professor of History and African American Studies at Brandeis University. Dr. Williams specializes in African American and modern U.S. history, African American military history, the World War I era, and African American intellectual history. His first book, Torchbearers of Democracy, African American Soldiers in the World War I era, was published in 2010 by the University of North Carolina Press. Widely praised as a landmark study, Torchbearers of Democracy won the 2011 Liberty Legacy Foundation Award from the Organization of American Historians and the 2011 Distinguished Book Award from the Society for Military History and designation as a 2011 Choice Outstanding Academic Title. Dr. Williams is co-editor of Charleston's Syllabus, Readings on Race, Racism, and Racial Violence, that's University of Georgia Press, 2016, and Major Problems in African American History, 2nd edition, that's Cengage Learning, 2016. His forthcoming book, The Wounded World, WEB Du Bois and the First World War, will be published by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Professor Williams. And remember to unmute yourself.
Got it. Thank you, Deborah, for that very kind introduction. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. Deborah, I want to thank you and everyone at the Waltham Library for organizing this series. It's so important that we celebrate Black history beyond just the month of February. So a year-long recognition of African-American history and its multiple iterations and expressions is a really important statement and a testament to the work that you're doing. It's a great pleasure to be able to participate as a member of the Brandeis University faculty. I think it's very important for Brandeis and our community to remain connected to the Waltham community. And it's a privilege to be able to do that. Hopefully we're good to go. I'm going to share my screen here. And what I like to do is actually start with a quote. And this is a quote from WEB Du Bois, the subject of my forthcoming book, which Deborah mentioned. For those of you who don't know who W.E.B. Du Bois is, he is one of the most, if not the most significant Black intellectuals, activists, civil rights leaders in American history, first African-American to receive a PhD from Harvard University. He was one of the co-founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. He was the author of dozens of books spanning a wide range of genres from history, sociology, literature, philosophy, and he was a activist, first and foremost, an artist and an activist who was truly unflinching in his support and quest for the cause of Black freedom and justice, not just in the United States, but across the globe. One of his, in my opinion, most important and less recognized books was written in 1924. He was the author, as I said, multiple books, probably his most famous being The Souls of Black Folk, published in 1903. And in 1924, he had the opportunity to publish another book with kind of a similar title, entitled The Gift of Black Folk. And it was a book that chronicled the contributions of African Americans to American history, to demonstrate how they had, in fact, shaped the course of American history in incredibly important ways, kind of similar to the purpose of this year-long speaker series. And one of the chapters that Du Bois wrote in The Gift of Black Folk was specifically dedicated to Black soldiers. And he began the chapter with a really striking quote. Du Bois wrote, "His problem as a soldier," referring to the Black soldier, "his problem as a soldier was always peculiar. No matter for what America fought and no matter for what her enemies fought, the American Negro always fought for his own freedom and for the self-respect of his race. Whatever the cause of war, therefore, his cause was peculiarly just. He appears, therefore, in American wars always with double motive: the desire to oppose the so-called enemy of his country, along with his fellow white citizens, and before that, the motive of deserving well of those citizens and securing justice for his folk." I think this quote really captures a central aspect of the Black military experience and captures it quite poignantly. The individual desires of Black soldiers for freedom and justice, securing justice for their folk, as well as what Black soldiers have historically symbolized. Thinking about Black soldiers as central to the larger cause of Black freedom and the securing of justice and civil rights for African Americans, and the ways in which they symbolized and encapsulated that struggle for African Americans more broadly. From this, I think we can also kind of ponder the experiences of Black veterans specifically and their struggles to secure justice, both for themselves individually and for the race more broadly. Allows us an opportunity to think about what veterans have done, think about them as historical actors, both individually and collectively, alongside their very powerful symbolism, what they have represented over the years. So that's really what I want to focus on for the next 20 minutes or so in my comments this evening. But before I go any further, I do want to offer a caveat of sorts. The experiences of Black soldiers over nearly 350 years of American history are incredibly diverse and complex. The story of each individual soldier who has served in the military is different. As such, the experiences of Black veterans are also incredibly diverse. We must therefore be extremely careful in making blanket generalizations. Some veterans took off their uniforms incredibly proud of their service. Some took off their uniforms and despised it, never wanted to see it again. And many veterans, probably the majority of Black veterans, were somewhere in between those two extremes. Some veterans hoped to return to a life of normalcy and fit into the civilian world as best as they could. Other veterans were determined to upend the status quo. Some veterans benefited from serving in the military, materially, as well as emotionally, psychologically, and a whole host of other ways. But other veterans suffered greatly and came out of their experiences damaged in ways that were quite profound as well. My point is that what I want to largely focus on this evening, how Black veterans shaped the long struggle for African American freedom and civil rights, is only part of a much larger and more complex story of what it is historically meant to be a Black veteran. So I'm only going to really scratch the surface. So I hope that you'll take advantage of the question and answer period if you'd like some more detail on anything that I have addressed, and also continue to do your own research beyond this evening, because there's so much more that has been written, that has been explored regarding the experiences of African Americans in the military and Black veterans specifically, that deserves attention beyond our time together this evening. So let's start at the beginning, and that would be with the American Revolution. African Americans served in the American Revolution in a number of different ways, in a number of different capacities. Historians estimate that between 5,000 and 8,000 peoples of African descent participated in the revolution on the Patriot side, and conversely, that upwards of 20,000 peoples of African descent served the crown, fought on the behalf of the British. That really hits an important point in thinking about the experiences of Black people in the American Revolution, in the sense that their main motivation for fighting in the war was freedom. And they looked for freedom wherever they could find it, whether it was with the Patriots, or whether it was with the Loyalists, or whether it was with the British Army more broadly. Freedom was the main motivation. George Washington and the Patriot forces were very hesitant to initially use peoples of African descent in the Continental Army, and eventually the exigencies of war, the pressures of war, changed the calculation, and that has historically been a phenomenon that has shaped the experiences of African Americans in the military. The pressure to use Black people in the Continental Army was increased when the Royal Governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, provided motivation for enslaved people to join the British forces with the promise of their freedom. And it really highlighted the ways in which race and slavery were at the center of the American Revolution in quite profound ways. This is a very famous picture painting by John Singleton Copley, The Death of Major Pearson, which depicts a Black servant fighting on behalf of the British. The veterans of the American Revolution, both on the Patriot side and on the British side, on the side of the Loyalists, really embodied the promise of American freedom, but most vividly, its hypocrisies, its failures when it came to Black people and enslaved people in particular. In most of the northern states, while abolition began to spread and take hold, free Black people lacked the rights afforded by the new Constitution. The Constitution also left slavery firmly intact in southern states and did nothing to curtail its eventual expansion. As for Black loyalists and enslaved people who fled to the British lines, while some gained their freedom, most were re-enslaved in the Caribbean and elsewhere. So this really speaks to the state of the new nation and what it meant to be a Black person in the new United States of America. The United States became a slave society following the ratification of the Constitution. In 1792, a federal law was instituted that barred Black people from bearing arms for the US Army. Militias were also empowered to put down slave insurrections. So military service connected to the maintenance of slavery and really the preservation of white supremacy was embedded in the new nation in the form of the Constitution itself. So African Americans only had limited opportunities to serve, mostly as servants in the War of 1812, as well as in the Mexican War in 1848. Things changed very dramatically with the American Civil War. The issues of emancipation and military service were intertwined from the onset of the war. When Fort Sumter was attacked by Confederate forces, it set off a rush of free Black men to enlist in the U.S. military. They wanted to serve their country as well. However, they were turned away. The Union Army initially wanted nothing to do with Black soldiers, and recognizing what a contentious issue that was, and also reflecting how Lincoln did not want to make the Civil War a war about the destruction of slavery. He famously said he could save the Union by ending slavery, he would. If he could save the Union by not ending slavery, he would do that as well. It was really Black people and Black soldiers, as I'll get to in a minute, who forced Lincoln to act and turn the tide of the war, and explicitly made it a war about the destruction of slavery. By mid-1862, an escalating number of slaves were escaping from their plantations, fleeing to Union lines. These so-called contrabands forced the Union Army to reckon with the presence of Black people in the Union Army. And combined with declining number of white volunteers, the increasingly pressing personnel needs of the Union Army, Black people themselves, enslaved as well as free, pushed the government to reconsider the use of Black soldiers in the Union Army. With the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, the Union finally formally accepted the recruitment of African peoples of African descent in the Union Army. Recruitment was initially slow. However, Black leaders like Frederick Douglass very actively and vigorously encouraged Black men to become soldiers as a way to secure the rights, the freedom, as well as the citizenship of African Americans. Douglass famously said once, "Let the Black man get upon his person the brass letter, U.S. Let him get an eagle on his button, and a musket on his shoulder, and bullets in his pocket. There is no power on earth that can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship." So the Civil War was very important in explicitly linking the aspirations, but also the realities, the political as well as material realities of citizenship for Black people with military service. By the end of the Civil War, roughly 179,000 Black men, constituting 10% of the Union Army, served as soldiers in the Union forces. Another 19,000 served in the Navy. Approximately 40,000 Black soldiers died over the course of the war, the majority from infection or disease. Black women who could not formally join the Army nevertheless served as nurses, spies, and scouts, with the most famous being Harriet Tubman, who scouted for the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers. She would go on to earn a military pension after the war, something that she advocated for very vigorously. Because of prejudice against Black soldiers, the majority were used as laborers, but nevertheless, many Black soldiers did serve with distinction in combat in a number of key battles. One of the most important, I might be skipping ahead here. Oh, I missed a slide. I wanted to include a slide of the famous 54th Massachusetts Regiment, who you might be familiar with, being local Boston folks that we are. The 54th made a name for itself at Fort Wagner in July of 1863, losing 2/3 of their officers and half their troops, but demonstrating that African Americans had the ability to be valiant combatants. By the end of the war, 16 Black soldiers had been awarded the Medal of Honor. And I wanted to show this picture, this series of paintings by Thomas Waterman Wood, entitled "A Bit of War History." which he painted over a 2-year period from 1865 to 1866, really depicting the remarkable transformation that service in the Union Army represented, going from a contraband, an enslaved person, putting on the Union blue, standing upright, of achieving a type of dignified manhood and militancy as well, and the ultimate sacrifice of being a veteran, but still being loyal to the country and proud of one's service, even in spite of the sacrifices that it entailed. So I think this series of paintings captures, very poignantly, again, what it means, what it meant to be a Black veteran, what it meant to serve in the Civil War, and what it meant to have the status of a veteran afterwards. Military service in the Union Army and the leadership skills and social status that went along with it provided a springboard for many veterans to engage in post-Civil War Reconstruction politics. The first picture here is of PBS Pinchback, who was the first African-American governor in American history. He served as governor of Louisiana. And the second image is of Robert Smalls, who was from South Carolina. He famously freed himself and his crew during the Civil War by commandeering a Confederate transport ship, the CSS Planter, in Charleston Harbor in May of 1862, sailed it through Confederate controlled waters and handed it to Union forces, where it became a Union warship. After the Civil War, he returned to his home in Beaufort, South Carolina, became a politician, won election as a representative to the South Carolina legislature, and eventually the US House of Representatives. So these men and many others really represented the fight for full Black citizenship and racial equality that was at the heart of Reconstruction. Reconstruction was also important for the future of African Americans in the military. In 1866, the Army established 6 segregated regiments, which were eventually combined into 4, consolidated into 4 units, the 9th and 10th Cavalry and the 24th and 25th Infantry Regiments. The men of these all-Black regular Army units would come to be known as the Buffalo Soldiers. The men of the Buffalo Soldiers served extensively in the American West, fighting in the so-called Indian Wars, clearing the West for expansion and American empire. See, there's some stark incongruities, we might say, of Black men fighting Native Americans and clearing the West for imperial expansion. But nevertheless, they fought very heroically and made a name for themselves. 18 African-American Buffalo Soldiers earned medals of honor. One of the most famous Buffalo Soldiers was Kathy Williams, who was the first Black woman to enlist in the American Army. She enlisted in 1866, but did so as posing as a man. And eventually she her identity was revealed, but nevertheless, she made a really important contribution in the context of service of women, African-American women in the military. The Buffalo Soldiers, the men of the Black Regulars, also served in the Caribbean and South Pacific during the Spanish-American War, and in the Philippines, as well as in Mexico. The Buffalo Soldiers symbolized freedom and citizenship at a time following the premature end of Reconstruction and the rise of the Jim Crow era, when African Americans had effectively been reduced to second-class citizens. They symbolized the promise of freedom and citizenship, again, at a time when it was being stripped away. So they held a very powerful symbolic importance. but also just in terms of what their service meant for them as individuals, and the opportunities that it provided for these men was incredibly important at a time when the vast majority of African Americans were being reduced to a near second slavery. They also symbolize leadership and manhood at a time when African Americans were being debased through racist imagery, of being depicted as childlike, as lacking that inherent mental and physical attributes of being strong leaders and strong men. Probably no other figure encapsulated this more powerfully than Colonel Charles Young. And to put his importance in some kind of perspective, he was, at the time of his service, Black America's Colin Powell before there was Colin Powell. He was the third African American to graduate from the United States Military Academy at West Point. He was the first Black U.S. National Guard superintendent, the first Black military attaché to Liberia. He was the first Black man to achieve the rank of colonel in the United States Army, and at the time of his retirement in the time of his death in 1922, he was the highest ranking Black officer in the Army. The picture with his autograph is really important. It was signed in July of 1919. And if you could read the inscription, it says, "For yours, race and country, Charles Young." Charles Young was someone who was deeply committed to the cause of racial uplift, of representing his race, but also committed to his country, and really sacrificed his life for both his race and his country. He wanted to be the first Black general. He was in line for a promotion to general when the United States entered World War I, but was unjustly forced into retirement. And his experience during the war in some ways really encapsulates the tragedies that African Americans had to contend with during World War I. The United States entered the war in April of 1917, with Woodrow Wilson famously declaring that the world must be made safe for democracy. His words inspired the hopes of African Americans. 380,000 Black soldiers ultimately served in the United States Army, some 200,000 actually serving overseas. There were Black officers who were commissioned. There were two Black combat divisions, the 92nd and 93rd Division. The men of the 93rd Division in particular were highly decorated. The famous Harlem Hellfighters of the 369th Infantry Regiment were one of the most famous regiments in the entire American Army. But the majority of Black soldiers served as labor troops, and this reflected both the segregated nature of the United States Army at the time, as well as how deeply ingrained white supremacy was within the American Army, and how racist policies governing the use and treatment of Black soldiers were the norm. As a result, many soldiers returned home deeply disillusioned by their experiences, but also determined to fight for their rights, to make democracy a reality upon their return to the United States, especially those who had been to France and experienced a taste of freedom and the possibility of a different world. The sentiment was best captured. There's an image of some of the Black labor troops. The sentiment, this disillusionment, but also this sense of hope and determination to fight was best captured by W.B. Du Bois in an editorial that he wrote for the Crisis magazine, which he edited for the NAACP in May of 1919, titled "Returning Soldiers." And he ended this very, very powerful editorial by saying, we return from fighting, we return fighting. Make way for democracy. We saved it in France, and by the great Jehovah, we will save it in the United States or know the reason why. African Americans returned home fighting, and in some ways they had to continue fighting, not just for their rights, but for their very lives, because racial violence, specifically directed against African American veterans, was endemic throughout the post-war period, and specifically during the summer of 1919, which came to be known as the Red Summer. Over a dozen African-American veterans were lynched. Race riots erupted throughout the country, such as the riot that took place in Chicago in late July of 1919. And this picture, I think, just very powerfully captures the determination that many Black veterans had in the midst of incidents like the Chicago riot to stand up for their rights, but also what they represented as well, both as a threat, but also as a source of inspiration and a source of resistance. The combined experiences of Black soldiers during the war, as well as the experiences that they had to endure following their return, inspired many Black veterans to indeed fight for their rights, inspired a spirit of militancy, which came to be known as the New Negro Movement in the post-World War I era. Many veterans joined radical organizations like the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which was established by Marcus Garvey. Some veterans joined the Communist Party. Others established organizations of their own, such as the League for Democracy, which was an all-Black veterans organization, which was led by a former officer, Osceola McCain, who served in the 92nd Division. And he said in a meeting that he held after the war, no Negroes anywhere in the United States should ever let white mobs take a Black man to lynch him without using all the force possible to prevent it. The only thing with which to meet force is force. And this type of mentality, this type of spirit of resistance really came to encapsulate what many African-American veterans felt in the aftermath of the war. Black veterans from World War I really laid the foundation for the modern civil rights movement. Probably the best example of this is Charles Hamilton Houston, who was an officer in World War I, had a very disillusioning experience, returned to the United States determined to fight for his rights, to never be caught off guard, as he put it, without knowing what his rights are. He went to Harvard Law School. He eventually became dean of Howard University Law School in Washington, DC. And he trained a generation of Black lawyers, including Thurgood Marshall, who would become the first Black Supreme Court justice. Charles Hamilton Houston also worked for the NAACP and helped spearhead its legal campaign, which laid the foundation for the dismantling of Jim Crow and the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954. So he was arguably one of the most key important figures in the 20th century civil rights movement and attacking Jim Crow. He was also very adamant about reforming the military, making sure that his experience in World War I was never repeated. When the United States was debating the creation of a new Selective Service Act in anticipation of possibly entering World War II, he testified before Congress and said that segregation in the Army needed to end and that African Americans needed to have equal rights, or the same problems that took place in World War I were going to repeat themselves. And in many respects, he was correct. The United States Army did make some important concessions in terms of the draft and making sure that, at least on its face, it was racially neutral. But many of the policies and practices that existed and that were implemented during World War I carried over into World War II. One of the most important differences, however, was how African Americans approached World War II. Learning from the mistakes that took place during the First World War and being very explicit about what they wanted to get out of the Second World War. In 1941, the Pittsburgh Courier, one of the most influential African-American newspapers in the country, coined the double V phrase and encouraged African-Americans to fight a double V, victory at home as well as victory abroad, fighting against fascism abroad, but also fighting against racism in the United States. And this really became a very powerful slogan and encapsulated kind of the hopes and aspirations and determination of African Americans during the war. During World War II, more than 2.5 million African American men registered for the draft. And combined with African American women who had volunteered, specifically in the Women's Army Corps, approximately 1.2 African Americans served in the United States Army during the war. They made important contributions. There were important changes from World War I, such as in the Air Force with the Tuskegee Airmen, as well as in the Army itself, kind of increased opportunities to serve in other branches of the military as well, such as the Navy, where the first 13 African-American officers were commissioned. So there were important changes that did take place from World War I to World War II. However, many of the same practices did remain in place. Segregation was still the norm, and the overwhelming majority of Black soldiers served as laborers in Europe, as well as in the United States. And the Jim Crow nature of training camps in the United States was particularly egregious. This really shaped how African Americans approached the post-war period as well. Similar to World War I, a number of African American veterans were brutalized, lynched following their return to the South. One of the most egregious cases involved Isaac Woodard, a veteran who was returning home in South Carolina, was beaten by police officers and was blinded, had his eyes gouged out. And he became a very powerful symbol for the type of racial abuse and violence, atrocities that were taking place, particularly in the South, towards African-American veterans following the war. But this incident and others also galvanized the federal government into action, and Harry Truman in particular, leading to the issuance of Executive Order 9981 in July of 1948, which formally integrated the military and mandated equality of treatment and opportunity. So the form of desegregation of the military in 1948 was directly tied to the experiences of Black veterans following the war and the outrage that their treatment elicited. This raised hopes for the experiences of Black soldiers in the Korean War, which the United States became involved in 1950. Approximately 600,000 African-American soldiers served in the armed forces during the Korean War. Approximately 5,000 lost their lives. While the United States Army was technically integrated, segregation still remained largely intact. It wasn't until 1954 when the last all-Black units were disbanded. And many of the racist policies that had been so deeply ingrained in the military remained in place during the Korean War. 1954 was also important, obviously, for the landmark Brown versus Board of Education case, which really spoke to how connected the military experiences were to the larger struggle of civil rights, particularly in the context of the United States. I was thinking about the civil rights, Black freedom struggle in the larger global context in which Black soldiers were intimately connected to. But the domestic struggle for civil rights was something that African-American veterans were deeply engaged in, both as foot soldiers, but also as leaders. Many African-American veterans who had served in World War II as well as in Korea returned back to the United States, taking advantage of the GI Bill when they had the opportunity to do so, and using their experiences to become really the torchbearers, if you will, of the modern Black freedom struggle in the 1950s and 1960s. So men like Robert Williams, who served in the Marines before returning to his home in Monroe, North Carolina, to head up the local NAACP branch in Monroe. He was famous, or depending on how you look at his experience, infamous for advocating armed self-defense, much to the dismay of national NAACP leaders. Men like Ames Moore, who served, who was a key organizer in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and Jose Williams, who was a key figure alongside Martin Luther King Jr. in the Southern Christian Leadership Congress. So these men and many other were very important in the civil rights struggle. Probably the most well-known Black veteran of World War II who served in a very important capacity in the Black freedom struggle in the 1950s and 60s was Medgar Evers. He served in World War II from 1943 to 1945, was honorably discharged as a sergeant, and he became the NAACP's first field secretary in Mississippi. He was tragically assassinated in front of his home on June the 12th, 1963. At the age of 37, was buried in Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. So again, Black veterans, World War II, as well as Korea, played a very important role in the civil rights struggle in the 1950s and 1960s. The US escalation in Vietnam highlighted the problems related to Black military service and its inextricable connection to the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr. himself very bravely spoke out against the war in Vietnam. And the experiences of Black soldiers really kind of reflected the tensions between serving the United States in a deeply unpopular war, but also kind of the heightened racial and political consciousness that was also characteristic of the times. A total of 300,000 African Americans served in Vietnam, and the Vietnam experience in some ways was reflective of the problem of using Black soldiers in a newly integrated army, one in which discrimination and white supremacy still was the norm, in spite of desegregation. African-American troops were more likely to be assigned to combat units. In 1965, African-Americans accounted for nearly 25% of all combat deaths in Vietnam. Project 100,000, which was implemented by Robert McNamara in 1966, pulled 40% of the men through that program were African American. By the following year, Black soldiers made up over 16% of men who were drafted into the United States Army and over 23% of Vietnam combat troops, despite only counting for 11% of the US population. So African Americans were disproportionately represented in the Army on the front lines, in particular during Vietnam. There were a number of racial incidents that highlighted the problems of Black soldiers serving in the war. But nevertheless, they served valiantly. 22 Black men received the Medal of Honor in spite of the host of challenges that existed. Vietnam also highlighted the connections between the war and the Black Power movement. By the late 1960s, Black Power had become more widespread, and that was reflected in the experiences of Black soldiers, as well as with Black veterans, men like Geronimo Pratt, who served 2 tours of duty in Vietnam, returned back to the United States, Los Angeles, became a key leader in the Black Panther Party in Los Angeles. He was actually imprisoned unjustly on a charge of murder for 27 years before finally being exonerated in 1997. The post-Vietnam period really spoke to the unique challenges that Black veterans faced. The fact that Black veterans were over twice as likely to experience post-traumatic stress disorder, more likely to have higher unemployment, struggle with addiction, other problems. But it also reflected opportunities that Black men in particular had for careers in the military, but also outside of the military, using their experiences, particularly during the Korean and Vietnam Wars, for careers in public service. So Charles Rangel, for example, the very famous congressman from New York, the longest serving at the time of his retirement, longest serving incumbent member of the House of Representatives, as well as Colin Powell, who recently passed away, probably the most well-known and most accomplished figure in, I would argue, in African-American military history. We cannot talk about Black veterans without mentioning his significant accomplishments, both in the military, as well as a civilian in becoming the first Black Secretary of State. So I think all of this is to really remind us of the important contributions that African-American soldiers and veterans have made to American history, but also particularly as we recognize Veterans Day tomorrow, the important role that Black veterans have and continue to play in our ongoing struggles for freedom and civil rights in this country. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and end there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Williams, for sharing with us this important history. We do have a comment for you from the audience. This viewer says, I'm writing a historical research project on unsung African-American heroes of US history, and this has been extremely helpful. So thank you.
Great, appreciate that.
I have a question for you. Can you talk a little bit more about why Black veterans were targeted for racial terror lynchings rather than hailed as patriots and heroes?
Sure. In part, it goes back to what African-American veterans have historically symbolized and represented, particularly in the context of the South, but also more broadly. I think we have to remember that American racial violence has not just been a Southern phenomenon, right? So if we look at an incident like Chicago, you had Black veterans who were specifically targeted in the Chicago race riot as well. Black veterans, particularly after World War I and World War II, represented freedom, represented the possibilities of citizenship, represented a challenge to the racial status quo. Wearing the uniform of the United States Army connoted a type of status and citizenship that ran counter to Jim Crow and the idea that Black men could not be equal citizens, could not even be equal human beings for that matter. So they represented a threat to the racial status quo. They represented a threat in the eyes of many white Southerners to the safety of white women. But they also were seen as possibly inspiring other African Americans to also challenge the racial status quo. So in terms of their actual physical presence, what they carried back with them to their communities, but also what they symbolically represented, those were very powerful, very visceral forces in the history of American racial violence, and made them targets, at the hands of white supremacists.
Thank you for that. Here's a question from our viewers. Can you talk a little bit about how Black veterans were not eligible for GI benefits, which plays a role in the ongoing wealth gap?
Absolutely. The GI Bill following World War II was really one of the most consequential moments in this country's economic history, I would argue, and paved the way for a generation of men and women to achieve upward mobility, to take advantage of housing opportunities, educational opportunities, really transformed the American middle class. And certainly a number of African-American veterans were indeed able to take advantage of GI Bill benefits, but the way it was administered was deeply discriminatory, which prevented the majority of African Americans who served in World War II specifically from taking full advantage of those benefits. So I think it is indeed fair to point to the GI Bill and the racially discriminatory ways it was implemented as furthering the historical wealth gap, racialized wealth gap in this country, and the direct correlation that has to I think some of the challenges that we continue to struggle with today in terms of unequal opportunities and ingrained disparities, particularly in the economic realm in this country. So without question, the GI Bill was a really important turning point, some ways a lost opportunity for the cause of equal justice, economic justice in this country's history.
Thank you. Here's another question. Fascinating to think of military service as inspiring the fight against racism back home. How about the Gulf War era? Did this have any impact in the 1990s on the fight against racism?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. And there's still, I think, a lot of research that needs to be done on the Gulf War and the impact that it has had on African-American life, politically, economically, but also in terms of the struggle for civil rights. One of the important things to keep in mind about the military, particularly during the 1980s and into the early 1990s, is that African Americans were again overrepresented in the military during this time, in large part because of the lack of economic opportunities that existed for many African Americans, particularly working class African Americans during the 1980s and 90s, where the policies of the Reagan and Bush administrations, were not favorable to many working class African Americans. So the military became one of the few really viable options for African American, working class African American men and women, and that really reflected, the composition of the American military during the first Gulf War. If you look back at some of those images, just the overrepresentation of Black people is quite stark. So I think that's a really important piece of the story, and also how that then shapes their racial consciousness and kind of aspirations for a better life following the end of their service. I think also the struggles with post-traumatic stress syndrome, Gulf War syndrome, as it came to be known, had a racialized component to it as well. And I think these are all things that continue, that still need to be studied and explored by historians and other scholars. But certainly a very important part of the history of African Americans in the military and veterans specifically.
Thank you. Here's a question. I've been told that Native Americans have a, quote, warrior culture that play into why Native Americans enlist in the US military at one of the highest rates per capita. Do African Americans have a similar cultural shorthand reason to enlist in the same way?
My short answer to that would be no. Again, I don't want to purport to be an expert on Indigenous histories and cultural traditions, but I am hesitant to ascribe any type of inherent kind of cultural trait to why a particular group would be motivated to join the American military. Again, I think you have to look at a number of different factors, including class, economic opportunity, et cetera, is why certain groups have historically been overrepresented in the military relative to their size in the population at large. Certainly there's no kind of cultural predisposition that African Americans have to join the military, but I will say that it's important to recognize that the military is an important part of African American history and African American familial and communal legacies. That there's probably very few families that you could find who do not have some type of connection to the military. So I think those type of connections are important. Obviously, there's been generations of Black soldiers, generations of Black families who have served in the military. But what that says, about any type of particular kind of cultural tradition, I think is probably not necessarily accurate.
Okay, we are bumping up against 8 p.m. So I think we will end this here. I want to thank you again, Professor Williams, for speaking with us tonight. It's been wonderful to host you. So thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you very much. This has been great, and continue the good work.
Thank you. Good night, everyone. Thanks for tuning in.
All right. Good night.